It is 4:30 in the morning in Linwood, California, October 1984. The street is dark. The neighborhood is quiet in the specific, held breath way that streets are quiet before something permanent happens in them. A car rolls to a stop at the curb, then another, then a third. The doors open. Men get out. They move toward a house with the unhurried precision of people who have rehearsed this, who know exactly which door they're walking to and exactly what they're going to say when it opens. One of them knocks. Inside the house, a man is already awake. Some part of him has been awake for weeks. His name is Richard William Miller. He is a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 14-year veteran, holder of a top-secret security clearance, sworn defender of the United States against foreign intelligence threats. The men standing at his door are his colleagues. Some of them have eaten lunch with him. Some of them have complained with him about the same supervisors, used the same coffee machine, sat through the same briefings. All of them are now here to arrest him on charges of espionage. He opens the door. He looks at them. He does not run. He does not fight. He does not say the thing that innocent men are supposed to say. What crosses his face, in the accounts of people who were present, is something that looks, more than anything else, like the expression of a man who has been waiting for this knock and is, in some terrible way he will never fully explain, almost relieved that the waiting is over. He will later say he was a hero, that the whole thing was a deliberate undercover gambit, that he was running her, the Soviet woman who had spent the summer sitting across from him in her apartment on Kenmore Avenue, the woman who had looked at him like he was the most interesting man she'd ever met, the woman whose connections to Soviet intelligence the Bureau had been tracking for years before the two of them ever sat down together in a vinyl booth over bad coffee. The question that will haunt this story, the question no court fully resolved, the question the historical record swallowed whole, is whether he was running her, or whether she was running him. Or whether the most accurate answer is the one nobody wanted to say out loud, that they were running each other, simultaneously, each convinced of their own control, neither one paying enough attention to notice that the whole thing was already burning down before it began. The first thing you need to understand is that nobody in this story was innocent. Not the woman who said she loved him, not the man who believed her, and not the institution that created the conditions for both of them to destroy each other. What you are about to hear is not a story about espionage in the way Hollywood taught you to think about espionage. There are no tuxedos. There is no Aston Martin. There is no villain standing in a volcano lair pressing a red button while the hero rappels down a glass wall. This story happens in a faded apartment in the San Fernando Valley, in the front seat of a government-issued Ford sedan, in the parking lot of a Westwood grocery store, in a motel room where the air conditioning rattled so loud you could not hear yourself think. It happens in the gap between two people who each thought they were smarter than the other, and neither one was paying enough attention to notice that the whole thing was already falling apart before it began. Hold on to that, because before we get to the parking lots and the classified documents and the moment that cracked open the myth of the Bureau's invulnerability, we need to go back. Back to two childhoods on opposite sides of the world, and the war that was quietly shaping both of them, years before either of them knew the other existed. It is 1955. In Brea, California, a small citrus and oil town in Orange County that smells, depending on the direction of the wind, either like orange blossoms or crude petroleum, A 7-year-old boy named Richard Miller is growing up in a house his father bought fast and cheap because fast and cheap was what was available after the war. The houses on his block are modest, the kind built for returning soldiers who needed somewhere to put their families and their unprocessed trauma. The lawns are immaculate because the lawns are always immaculate in towns like this. Appearance is the currency of respectability, and everyone is paying their dues. Richard is not a remarkable child. His teachers do not write prophetic notes about his potential. He is pudgy in the way that some boys are pudgy, the kind that other boys notice and use as a data point when deciding who goes last in kickball. He reads. He is curious. He has a certain low-frequency stubbornness that could, in the right circumstances, look like determination, and, in the wrong ones, look like the inability to accept that he is already lost. His father's a church-going man. The Mormon faith runs through the Miller family like a second circulatory system, shaping not just their Sundays, but the entire architecture of how they understand obligation, duty, sacrifice, and the terrifying weight of moral accountability. Richard will be baptized. Richard will do what is expected. Richard will, for the entirety of his life, be trying to do what is expected of him, and failing at it in ways that accumulate so slowly they are almost invisible until suddenly they are all you can see. At the same moment, on the other side of the world, a girl named Svetlana Korolyova is growing up in a Soviet city with no orange blossoms and no lawns to keep immaculate. The exact contours of her Soviet childhood are difficult to verify in the way that the childhoods of people who later become intelligence subjects are always difficult to verify. The records that exist were created by institutions with reasons to shape them. But the general outlines are clear enough. She is growing up in a system that has made scarcity structural, a system that has made surveillance architectural, a system where the walls of your apartment are thin enough that your neighbors can hear you sneeze, and everyone knows that some of those neighbors have additional motivations for paying attention. She is, by all accounts, a striking girl. Not beautiful in the way that opens doors effortlessly, beautiful in the way that makes people pay attention before they've decided they want to. She is smart in a way that Soviet education shapes and redirects, taught to apply intelligence to the system rather than against it, taught that the difference between a person who rises and a person who disappears is often simply a question of knowing which questions not to ask out loud. These two children, Richard in his Orange County house that smells like petroleum, Svetlana in her Soviet apartment where the walls remember everything, have nothing in common except the year and the war that neither of them is fighting yet, the war that is already fighting them. It will take 30 years and the specific cruelty of geography and circumstance to put them in the same parking lot. But those 30 years are not wasted. Those 30 years are the machine that manufactures the conditions for everything that follows. To understand the parking lot, you need to understand the machine. Let's talk about the Cold War. Not the history textbook version with the clean dates and the tidy chapter headings, not the missile crisis, not the Berlin Wall, not those bright, cinematic moments of superpower confrontation that make for good documentaries and easy moral geography. The everyday Cold War. The one that ran continuously, invisibly, like a low-frequency electrical current through every institution, every family, every decision made by two superpowers who had pointed enough nuclear weapons at each other to end the civilization they were each claiming to defend. By the early 1980s, the Cold War has been running for nearly 4 decades. It has settled into something more insidious than crisis, something more bureaucratic, more patient, more quietly corrosive. It is a war of paper and attrition. A war fought in the cubicles of federal office buildings and the parking lots of shopping centers and the phone booths outside grocery stores. A war where the most dangerous people are not the ones carrying weapons, but the ones carrying information. And there is an enormous amount of information in the United States worth carrying. The KGB, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, the Committee for State Security, is, in this period, the largest intelligence apparatus in human history. Somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 officers and employees, a budget that is not publicly reported because the Soviet Union does not have transparent budgets. 12 main directorates, each responsible for a different dimension of the organization's mission. The second Chief Directorate handles domestic counterintelligence, finding foreign spies on Soviet soil. The first Chief Directorate handles foreign intelligence, finding people like Richard Miller. The first Chief Directorate's American operations are run out of a facility in Moscow called Yasenyevo, set in a birch forest on the southwestern outskirts of the city. The building is modern, functional, clean. It smells of concrete and recycled air and the particular mineral quality of Soviet building materials. The officers who work there are, many of them, people who have never been to the United States, but who have studied it with an intensity that most Americans never apply to their own country. They know the geography, they know the cultural references. They have built from the outside a detailed model of what America is and how it works. More importantly, they know how to find the cracks. They know that a person under financial pressure is a different kind of asset than a person under ideological pressure. They know that a person who feels overlooked by their institution is more useful than a person who feels overtaxed by it. They know that the most valuable people are often not the most important people. They are the people with access to critical information who are not important enough themselves to be watched carefully. They have been studying this for 40 years. They are very good at it. There is something else you should know now, something I want you to hold in your mind as we move forward because it will become important later, more important than it seems right now. At some point during the summer of 1984, Richard Miller will later claim, he left a voicemail for his supervisor, a single voicemail, a message that would, if it existed, change the legal and moral meaning of everything he did. No record of that voicemail was ever found. Keep that detail. We'll come back to it. Richard Miller joined the Los Angeles field office of the FBI in 1970. He is 22 years old. He has passed the bar exam. He has options. He chooses the Bureau because the Bureau means something. It means you are one of the people who stand between the American way of life and the forces that want to dismantle it. He believes this. In 1970, with the genuine conviction of a young man who has been raised to understand duty as something real and sacred, Richard Miller believes this completely. The ambition metabolizes slowly. By 1984, he weighs somewhere around 250 pounds. He is supposed to weigh around 200. The difference matters in the FBI, the way visible things always matter in institutions that run on visible things. He has been disciplined repeatedly for tardiness, for sloppy paperwork, for once selling Amway products out of his government vehicle, a fact that his colleagues will never fully let go of because it is the kind of detail that attaches itself permanently to a person's reputation like a barnacle. He has been demoted. He has been reassigned to a position that even its official title makes sound like a punishment. He processes foreign counterintelligence reports. He reads what other people have gathered and files it correctly. He knows where everything is, but he is not the person gathering it. He is the person who knows exactly how the game is played, who has spent 14 years watching other people play it, who has accumulated the knowledge without the authority. He has 6 children. His marriage to Paula Miller is not collapsing in any dramatic way. It is simply failing to cohere, the two people inside it gradually becoming strangers who share a house and a last name and a set of obligations they have each privately stopped believing in, but publicly maintain because stopping feels more catastrophic than continuing. They are behind on their mortgage, behind on their car payments. Miller sells avocados from his property as a side business. He is a federal law enforcement officer with a top-secret clearance selling fruit to make ends meet. And there is something about that particular image that should be funny and somehow is not. He has become the person nobody at the Bureau wants to be and nobody wants to admit exists. The person who stayed too long. The person the system was supposed to sort out but did not. Because the system is as imperfect as the people inside it, and sometimes people fall through the cracks that the system pretends do not exist. He is 46 years old. He is hungry, not for avocados, not for a better mortgage, hungry for the feeling of being significant, of being the one who sees what others miss, of being, finally, after 14 years, the agent who matters. On the other side of that equation, in an apartment on Kenmore Avenue in the Koreatown-adjacent neighborhood of Los Angeles, Svetlana Ogorodnikova is trying to figure out what to do with her life. She is 34 years old. She arrived in the United States as part of the Soviet Jewish emigration wave of the late 1970s, a period when diplomatic pressure and trade negotiations produced a crack in the Soviet system wide enough for a certain number of people to slip through. She came with a husband, Nikolai Ogorodnikov, and the specific combination of relief and disorientation that characterizes people who spent years trying to leave a country and then, upon leaving it, discover that freedom does not arrive with a manual. Los Angeles gave her sunshine and car exhaust and a city that made no intuitive sense to someone used to the compressed, vertical logic of Soviet urban planning. Los Angeles is a city that does not believe in centers. It sprawls. It metastasizes across a basin that was never meant to contain this many people, serviced by a freeway system that created, rather than solved, the problem of infinite accessible distance. To live in Los Angeles is to spend a significant portion of your waking life in a car, inching forward on the 405 or the 101 or the 10, radio on, the city extending in every direction with the placid indifference of a place that has never needed you to understand it. Her apartment is on the second floor of a 2-story building. The stairs are concrete and make a specific hollow sound when you climb them, a sound that travels, a sound that anyone paying attention would recognize as footsteps that do not belong to a resident. The door is hollow core wood, the kind that provides the impression of privacy without any of its actual properties. Inside, a small living room, a kitchen that opens directly onto it with no wall between them, the specific quality of light that comes through net curtains in a California afternoon, diffuse and slightly yellow, turning everything it touches into the color of old photographs. It smells like tobacco, Svetlana smokes, and like the particular combination of Russian cooking and American convenience food that characterizes the émigré kitchen, where you make borscht but also keep a cabinet full of Campbell's soup because the borscht takes time you do not always have. On a shelf, a small collection of books in Russian, a framed photograph of a place that is not California. She is unhappy in her marriage, in the quiet, chronic way that many people are unhappy in their marriages, with occasional breaks of genuine connection that make the rest of the time harder to bear. She is trying to build something every day in a country that gave her the right to try without giving her any particular advantage in the trying. She is smart. She is resourceful. She has the specific resilience of a person who grew up in a system that offered resilience as its primary curriculum. She is also, by 1984, already known to the FBI, not as a suspect, exactly, as a person of interest, a person the Bureau maintained a file on because she was connected to people who warranted attention. She traveled to the Soviet consulate. She maintained relationships with Soviet officials. She had been approached previously and used, in a limited and carefully managed way, as an informant. She was what the intelligence community calls an access agent, a person who can provide access to targets, or who is herself a potential target, depending on which direction the current is running. She was also a woman of considerable personal magnetism, which is not a professional assessment but a human one, and the distinction matters. There was something about her, the accent, the directness, the quality of her attention when she focused it on you, the sense that she had survived things you could not imagine, and that this had made her permanently unimpressed by the things that impress ordinary people. She had the specific allure of a person who has already seen the worst and decided to enjoy the rest. Two people, two different kinds of hunger, two different sets of tools. And now, both of them, converging on the same corner of the same city in the same broken year. Before we get to what happens next, if you're new to this channel, this is what we do here. Small people, big history. The stories that did not make the textbooks. Subscribe if that sounds like your kind of thing. There's more where this is coming from. Now, back to Los Angeles. They meet in May of 1984. The exact circumstances have been described differently by different people at different times, which is either a testament to the unreliability of memory or a testament to the fact that several of the people involved had excellent professional reasons to be strategic about which version of events they committed to on the record. What is agreed upon? Richard Miller, in his capacity as an FBI agent with counterintelligence responsibilities, makes contact with Svetlana Ogorodnikova. It is, at least initially, entirely within the scope of his professional duties. She is a person the Bureau has an interest in. He is a Bureau agent. He talks to her. The meetings begin formally. An agent and a source. A coffee shop, the kind that in 1984 still had vinyl booths and laminated menus and coffee that tasted like it had been keeping warm since the Truman administration. The sound of ceramic cups on formica. The smell of bacon grease and bleach, and the specific staleness of a room where the air conditioning works better than the ventilation. Miller in his Bureau-issue suit that does not quite fit right anymore, his tie slightly askew, the sheen of perspiration on his forehead that never entirely goes away. Svetlana in something that costs less than it looks like it costs, because she has the talent of a woman who grew up in a system of scarcity for making do look like abundance. She watches him. He watches her. They talk about nothing important. They are both, in different ways, trying to figure out what the other one wants. This moment, this specific, unremarkable coffee shop meeting in May of 1984, is the moment that psychologists and investigators and journalists will eventually spend thousands of pages analyzing. Because what happens in the weeks that follow, as the meetings become more frequent and the conversations become more personal, and the professional framework that supposedly governs all of it becomes increasingly theoretical. What happens in those weeks is the entire story. Let me explain something about intelligence work, because it matters here. Real counterintelligence work, the grinding, procedural, mostly invisible work that the FBI's Foreign Counterintelligence Division performs every day, is fundamentally a discipline of controlled relationship. You cultivate people. You maintain relationships that are, by their nature, artificial, constructed for a purpose, sustained by a calculated mixture of genuine connection and professional manipulation, designed to extract something. The relationship is real in the sense that the people inside it are real people with real feelings. But it is also always a mechanism, a tool. The occupational hazard, the one that training programs discuss in the abstract and practitioners discover in the specific, is that human beings are not well designed for holding both dimensions simultaneously, the professional and the personal, the mechanism and the feeling. The long game and the immediate, physical, emotionally compelling reality of sitting across from another person who is looking at you like you are the most interesting thing in the room. A good counterintelligence agent can watch a Soviet asset deploy the full repertoire of rapport-building techniques. The attentiveness, the manufactured vulnerability, the way certain people learn to listen with their whole body as though you are saying the most important thing anyone has ever said, and recognize it for what it is. Miller was not, by 1984, operating at peak capacity. Think about what he was carrying. 14 years of feeling like a failure in an institution that defined him. 6 children. A mortgage he could not cover. A supervisor who had documented his shortcomings with the procedural thoroughness of someone building a file, which he was. A career moving in one direction only. And now, suddenly, in a vinyl booth in a coffee shop that smells like industrial cleaning product and old bacon grease, a woman looking at him like he was exactly the person she had been waiting for. The question is whether he was naive enough to believe it. The answer is more complicated than naive. By summer of 1984, the meetings are happening several times a week. The conversations have moved well past any professional frame. Svetlana is telling him things about herself. He is telling her things about himself. They have moved from the parking lots. The logic of parking lots for clandestine meetings is obvious. Everyone in a parking lot has a reason to be there and a reason to leave, and purpose provides cover. To her apartment on Kenmore Avenue, the hollow stairs, the net curtains, the smell of tobacco and borscht and old paper. Miller sits in her living room. He thinks he is doing his job. What Miller will later claim is that during this period, Svetlana began making her approach. Explicitly, she told him, and he will say, that she was working for the KGB. She told him she needed a document, a specific document, a classified FBI manual on foreign counterintelligence methods, the kind of document that would allow the KGB to understand exactly how the Bureau was watching them, exactly what was known, exactly where the gaps in American counterintelligence were that could be exploited. She offered money. She offered gold. She offered, and here is where the story achieves a kind of operatic, almost absurd intensity, her own body. Miller will say he recognized this as the operation it was. He will say he understood immediately that this was a Soviet recruitment approach against an American intelligence official, and that the correct response, the response he claims he chose, was to play along, to appear cooperative while actually working against them, to run a double-agent gambit without authorization because he was afraid his supervisors would shut it down before it could produce intelligence. He will say he was running her. And here is the thing that makes this story impossible to close cleanly. There is a version of events in which that is true. There is a version of events in which a desperate, overlooked, financially ruined FBI agent saw a Soviet approach coming and made a unilateral decision to be the hero, in which everything he did was deliberate, in which his crime, if it was a crime, was arrogance and procedural negligence rather than treason. There is also a version of events in which a woman who had been trained, directly or indirectly, by one of the most sophisticated intelligence organizations in human history, looked across a vinyl booth at a man who was drowning and decided he was exactly what she needed. I want you to think about both of those versions, because right now, before we go any further, I want to ask you directly, based on what you know so far, which do you believe? The comments are open. Tell me. I'll tell you what I think at the end of this video, and I guarantee you the answer is not what you're expecting. August 1984. The heat in Los Angeles in August is not the clean, dry heat of the desert. It is the specific gray-brown photochemical heat of a basin city pressed down by the layer of smog that sits over the city like a lid on a pot. The air tastes slightly metallic. The mountains that ring the basin are invisible behind haze. The streets shimmer. At night, the temperature drops only slightly, and the city breathes out the heat it has collected all day in slow, warm exhalations that make sleeping difficult and thinking harder. Miller retrieves the document. Let's sit with what that moment actually is. What it feels like, physically, to do what he does. He has handled classified materials for 14 years. He knows the protocols, the sign-out procedures, the institutional safeguards that exist specifically to prevent exactly this. He navigates them. He takes the document from its proper location. It is paper. Actual paper. In 1984. Because the digital revolution that will eventually make this kind of theft both easier and more traceable is still mostly theoretical. Paper has a smell, slightly acidic, faintly dusty, the smell of processed wood pulp and printer ink, and the specific institutional quality of pages that have been handled by many hands in climate-controlled rooms. It has a weight, a thickness, a physical reality that cannot be undone once it is in motion. The sweat on his palms makes it harder to hold than it should be. He carries it out of the building. The building does not stop him. He gives it to Svetlana. If he is running a double-agent operation, this is the moment of maximum exposure. The moment when he has provided exactly what was asked for, when he is most vulnerable, when the operation either produces the intelligence he's hoping for or collapses into something that cannot be recovered from. If he is not running a double-agent operation, if he is simply a man who has been recruited by Soviet intelligence, who has agreed to betray his country for money and sex and the desperate, hungry feeling of finally mattering to someone, then this is the point of no return. The document leaves his hands and enters hers, and from that moment forward there is no version of events in which he is not guilty of something. He later says he told his supervisor. He later says he left a voicemail. No record of any such communication was ever found. The FBI became aware that something was wrong through the specific, grinding, unglamorous process by which counterintelligence agencies almost always become aware that something is wrong. Not a dramatic revelation, not a double agent sending a burst transmission from a parking garage, but the slow accumulation of small anomalies that individually mean almost nothing and collectively mean everything. Surveillance logs, phone intercepts. The careful, painstaking cross-referencing of contact patterns. Who is meeting with whom, how often, where, what breaks the established baseline. Someone notices that Richard Miller is having frequent, irregular contact with a person the Bureau has an existing file on. Someone notes that the contact pattern matches no authorized operational activity. Someone pulls Miller's personnel file and reads it with fresh eyes, the eyes of a person who is now looking for something specific rather than simply processing information. The picture assembles itself slowly. Then, in the way of these things, suddenly. The investigation of Richard Miller by his own colleagues begins with a quality of cognitive dissonance that the agents involved will describe later as physically uncomfortable. Nobody wants to believe it. The Bureau does not have a psychological framework for this, not because procedures do not exist, but because the idea that a Bureau agent would commit espionage runs so contrary to the foundational mythology of the institution that the possibility has been treated as theoretical rather than operational. The procedures exist on paper. The actual experience of turning them on one of your own does not. Miller is watched, his phone is monitored, his movements are logged. The men watching him are the men he has worked with for years. Men who have sat in the same briefings, complained about the same supervisors, used the same coffee machine. They are listening to his phone calls and tracking his location and building a case against him with the same thoroughness they would apply to a Soviet asset, which is, technically, what he is. There is one more thing happening at this moment that the Bureau does not yet know, that even Miller may not fully understand. The document he removed is already in transit. The classified FBI manual on foreign counterintelligence methods has already moved from Svetlana's hands into channels that lead back to a facility in a birch forest outside Moscow, where officers who have never been to California are reading about the specific techniques the Bureau uses to watch people like them. The damage is done before the investigation confirms it happened. This is the specific horror of the case, not the betrayal. Betrayals have happened before and will happen again, and institutions absorb them. The specific horror is the window. The weeks between the document leaving the building and the FBI closing in, during which the information was already somewhere else, already being processed, already being used to identify gaps and vulnerabilities and blind spots in American counterintelligence that would take years to fully map and longer to repair. The arrest comes in the early morning hours of October 2nd, 1984, 4:30 a.m. The cars at the curb, the colleagues at the door. Miller opens it. He is arrested on charges of espionage. He is the first FBI agent in the Bureau's history to face that charge. He does not run. He does not fight. He looks at the faces he knows, and something in his own face, in the accounts of people present, does something complicated. Not shock, not blankness. Something closer to the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for weeks and has just been told he is allowed to set it down. He will later tell his lawyer that he was relieved they finally came, that the waiting had been the worst part. Svetlana Ogorodnikova and her husband Nikolai are arrested at approximately the same time. Their apartment is searched, their papers examined, their connections mapped with the forensic thoroughness of an investigation that has been building for weeks. Svetlana does not, in the immediate aftermath, perform the specific kind of collapse that guilt is supposed to produce in people confronted with evidence of it. She maintains. She adjusts. She calculates. As people who have grown up in systems that value survival over transparency always calculate what they know, what can be confirmed, what must be denied, and what version of events can be constructed from the available materials. The Bureau absorbs the news about Miller with the institutional stoicism of an organization that has no choice but to keep functioning regardless of what happens inside it. Paperwork continues. Surveillance continues. Coffee is consumed. But something has changed. A hairline fracture in the mythology, in the foundational assumption that the people inside the Bureau are, by definition and by nature, the people on the right side of the line. The mythology will not recover fully. It has already been true, somewhere in a set of Moscow files, that it was false. The trials begin in 1985. Let me take you into the courtroom. Not the summary version, the actual room. The United States District Court for the Central District of California, Los Angeles. The room has the specific quality of federal courtrooms in this era. Institutional carpet in a color that suggests authority without warmth, fluorescent lighting that flattens everything it touches, wooden furniture that is solid and deliberate and communicates permanence. The air is climate-controlled to a temperature that is neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. The air conditioning produces a faint, continuous hum, low enough to ignore, high enough to be there. Miller sits at the defense table. He is heavier than the photographs from his FBI ID. He has the careful, slightly artificial stillness of a man who has been coached about how stillness reads to a jury, and he is applying it imperfectly. His hands move occasionally, adjusting papers he does not need to adjust, performing the small, involuntary fidgets of a person whose body cannot entirely commit to the posture his lawyers have prescribed. Across the room, the prosecution has stacked its evidence with the architectural precision of people who have been building this case for a year. Documents, phone records, surveillance logs, the testimony of agents who watched Miller and Svetlana meet, who logged the dates and times and locations, who noted the contact pattern that matched no authorized operational purpose. And then there's the document itself. The classified FBI manual on foreign counterintelligence methods, which was removed from Bureau files and which ended up in Soviet hands. This is not contested. This is stipulated. The document left the building. Miller took it. Svetlana received it. These are facts that both sides agree on. What is contested, what the jury is being asked to evaluate, and what no jury will ever fully resolve, is what was in Richard Miller's mind when he did it. His defense attorney stands and makes the argument. It is a strange argument, and it has a certain internal coherence that makes it genuinely difficult to dismiss entirely. Miller recognized the approach, the attorney argues. Miller understood he was being recruited by Soviet intelligence. Miller made a decision, unauthorized, procedurally incorrect, the kind of decision that no FBI manual sanctions and no supervisor would approve. To play along. To appear to cooperate. To position himself as a double agent without telling his handlers because he was afraid they would shut the operation down before it could yield results. He was not betraying his country. He was trying to serve it. Badly, alone, with instruments he did not know how to use. The prosecutor rises. The absence of any record, the prosecutor argues, is not because Miller failed to follow procedure. It is because there was no operation. There was a man in financial ruin and personal desperation who was approached by a Soviet asset and who said yes. who gave away classified materials in exchange for money and sex and the intoxicating sensation of being, for the first time in 14 years, the person who mattered. Who, when the walls closed in, constructed a narrative that could theoretically account for his actions without making him guilty of them. The jury is quiet. The fluorescent lights hum. Miller adjusts the papers in front of him. The first trial ends in a mistrial. Procedural issues with jury instructions. The case goes back to the beginning. The second trial arrives with the weight of a thing that has already been done once and must be done again. The courtroom is the same. The fluorescent lights are the same. The hum of the climate control is the same. But something has shifted. In the public understanding of the case, in the accumulated weight of the evidence, in the specific, grinding exhaustion that multiple trials impose on the narrative of innocence. The jury deliberates. They return a verdict. Richard William Miller is convicted of espionage. He is sentenced to 2 life terms, plus 50 years. There is a moment, in the accounts of people present, after the sentence is read, a moment in the courtroom before the procedural mechanics of adjournment begin, when Miller is very still. Stiller than he was during the trial. Stiller than he was at the door at 4:30 in the morning. Whatever has been holding him in the shape of a man who still believes he might be vindicated has quietly released its tension. He is let out. Svetlana Ogorodnikova receives 18 years. Nikolai, her husband, convicted of being an accessory, of knowing what was happening inside his own home and choosing not to report it, receives 8 years. 3 sentences, 3 people, 1 classified document, 1 summer in Los Angeles. 1 question that nobody, not the prosecution or the defense or the FBI's own internal review, has ever answered with complete certainty. The sentence is not the end. It rarely is. Miller files appeals. The machinery of the federal court system processes them with the grinding patience it applies to everything. In 1990, his conviction is overturned on procedural grounds. The jury instructions. Again, the same technical issue that ended the first trial, finally finding purchase on appeal. A third trial is convened. This time the jury takes less time. He is convicted again. The sentence is reduced to 20 years. He will be released in 1994 after serving 9 years. 9 years in which the Cold War he was accused of serving ended, in which the Soviet Union dissolved, in which the Berlin Wall came down on live television while people in the West watched with the slightly stunned expression of people who had been told something was permanent for so long they had stopped questioning it, and then one day it simply was not. He is released into a world that has reorganized itself around him. He does not become a hero. He does not write a memoir that reframes the story convincingly enough to change the verdict of history. He does not give interviews in which some previously unknown fact emerges to vindicate the double agent theory. He returns to a life stripped of the things that defined him: the career, the badge, the authority, the institutional identity that, whatever its failures, had at least been his. And the man who comes out of prison is barely recognizable as the man who went in. He lives quietly. He insists, for as long as anyone asks him, that he was running her. Svetlana is released in 1994 as well. She returns to the émigré community, to something that resembles a life. The details of what that life looks like are private in the way that the lives of people who have been publicly consumed by history and survived it sometimes become private. A deliberate withdrawal into the small, the specific, the unheroic daily routine that does not require anyone to watch or judge. But here is the question I promised I would answer. The question I asked you to hold when we were still in the parking lots, when the document was still in the building, when everything was still theoretical. Was Miller running her? Here is what I believe. I believe Richard Miller made a decision that contained, simultaneously, two true things that his brain refused to allow to exist in the same room. I believe that he recognized, genuinely recognized, with the professional instinct of a 14-year counterintelligence analyst, that Svetlana was a KGB asset making a recruitment approach. And I believe that he also wanted what she was offering badly enough that the recognition became, in the specific alchemy of desperation and self-deception, a justification rather than a warning. I believe he told himself he was running her because telling himself that was the only way he could do what he was doing without becoming the person he was becoming. That is not a legal verdict. That is a human one. The courts have already delivered the legal verdict. They delivered it 3 times. What the courts could never touch, what no court can touch, is the interior of a decision. The specific geography of a man's self-understanding at the moment he crosses a line he has spent a career drawing. The way a story about ourselves can become so structurally necessary to our identity that we cannot see it as a story anymore. We just see it as the truth. This is not a defense of Richard Miller. He did what he did. The damage was real. The cost to American intelligence was real and took years to assess. It is, instead, an observation about something that the Cold War produced in people on both sides of it. A kind of collective institutional pressure that bent individuals in directions they might not have gone in a world that did not require them to be permanently suspicious, permanently vigilant, permanently certain that the person across from them was either an asset or a threat. Miller was not equipped to hold that pressure. He cracked in the specific way that men crack when they need to be heroes and have been given no outlet for it. Svetlana, what did she want? What was she, really, in the end? The historical record has her conviction. It has her sentence. It has transcripts of interviews and depositions in which she speaks with the careful imprecision of someone who knows every word is being evaluated for its evidentiary value. It does not have her interior life. It does not tell us what she thought, lying in a federal detention facility in California, far from anything she had ever understood about the world, about the choices that had brought her to this specific room, in this specific country, in this specific life. Whether she was a knowing agent executing a textbook recruitment operation, or a desperate woman using the tools available to her, or someone being run by the KGB in ways she did not fully understand, used as an instrument without being told she was an instrument. All 3 of those things are possible. None of them are mutually exclusive. The Cold War ended, officially, ceremonially, in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved. The men and women who had spent their careers on both sides of the divide woke up in a world that had reorganized itself overnight and tried to figure out what their expertise was worth when the enemy it was designed for no longer existed. Some of them adjusted. Some of them did not. Some of them found that the skills and habits and specific lens through which they had learned to see the world, the paranoid, layered, nothing is what it appears epistemology of intelligence work, had become so integrated into their perception that removing it would have been like removing something load-bearing. You could not take out the paranoia without taking out the structure. The files remain. declassified, partially, in the years following the Soviet collapse. Documents that were once worth careers and lives and decades of imprisonment are now available in archives, photocopied and digitized, and uploaded to servers where anyone with enough patience can read them. The document Miller took from the Bureau's files, the communications that moved between Los Angeles and Moscow, the bureaucratic residue of a relationship that destroyed at least 3 people and compromised American intelligence in ways that took years to fully map. Paper, ink, the smell of old files. History, in the end, is always analog. Here is what I want you to sit with as this story closes. The intelligence services of both sides in the Cold War built their operations on a foundational axiom that human beings are ultimately legible. That with enough information, enough surveillance, enough analysis, you can understand what a person is going to do before they do it. That motivation is a calculation that can be reversed engineered. That people, at sufficient resolution, become predictable. The Ogorodnikov-Miller case is a 40-year refutation of that axiom. Because the thing that makes this story irreducible, the thing that makes it impossible to fully close, even now, even with the files and the transcripts and 3 separate jury verdicts, is that nobody involved was fully legible, even to themselves. Miller could not clearly articulate, even under oath, where his professional self-deception ended and genuine treason began. Svetlana could not, or would not, clearly articulate what she actually understood about who was using whom. The FBI could not fully explain how it had kept a man so comprehensively unfit for his responsibilities in a position of access to materials so sensitive that his failure cost the country years of compromised intelligence. They were all, in their different ways, performing a role they had partially written and partially been handed by forces too large and too institutional to refuse. They were all, in the end, small people in an enormous game. They were all, in the end, wrong about how the game would end. That is not a comforting place to leave this story, but the honest ones never are. If this one hits you the way it hit me when I first went down this rabbit hole, there's more. The next video goes somewhere you won't not expect. It's already queued up. You know what to do. And tell me in the comments, was Miller running her? Or was she running him? Or were they both just 2 desperate people who convinced themselves they were playing a game that was actually playing them? I read every comment, and I'll be in there. The FBI agent thought he was running her. Well, he was wrong. But then again, so was she.